So very good evening to everyone. I will be starting from where Madam has left the discussion. So children, as you have already seen, are most likely to be asymptomatic or they have minor symptoms for COVID. So we have to remember that even though these are minor symptoms, they are still more likely to spread infections than adults because they tend to cry and cough a lot, which are itself aerosol generating procedures. And any age, even neonates and infants can be carriers for diseases. So this should not make you complacent that you will not take universal precautions. Remember that a dictum for all patients is universal precautions for all. Now you can see from this in early April, one of the most premier institutes in the world, Great Ormond Street Hospital, had reported that around 70 of their staff, which is around 6 to 7% of their total staff, had come positive for coronavirus. So we have to remember that children, while doing children, you should not become complacent because they may be carriers for the disease, and you should not become like you have to take universal precautions for all cases. Now, as a pediatric anesthesiologist, you have multiple roles. So far, we have been doing only emergency cases, but we have to remember that elective cases may start in some time and we have to be prepared for that. Our role as a team leader will always be there in an operation theater. Then we have a role in the PICU, which Madam will be covering in the later half of the session, where she will be doing with the focus for pediatric anesthesiologists. Also, besides this, we have a lot of other calls like intubation, venous access calls, sometimes lumbar punctures for fever and all. So as pediatric anesthesiologists, we have to do these kind of cases. So as children's anesthesia services, in the past 1.5 months, we have been doing only emergency cases. There are no elective cases, but we may be starting elective cases maybe in a week or two. So far we have done neonatal emergencies like tracheoesophageal fistulas, congenital diaphragmatic hernias, atresia, malrotation, ruptured meningomyelocele, volvulus. Even neonatal hernias are emergencies and they cannot wait because they tend to get obstructed. So these are the kind of cases we have been doing. Even minor cases like CLWs, uh, INDs are some cases like we are doing these kind of cases. In bigger children, we are doing cases like laparotomies, appendicectomies, trauma for fractures, head injuries, foreign bodies. So these are the cases we have been doing in the past month. Remember that malignancies which for which staging can change are sort of semi-emergencies and they have to be done in this period. So, as far as pediatric data is concerned, most of the data for coronaviruses so far is only consensus guidelines and expert opinion. There are early data with some trials, but they cannot be relied upon. So, whenever we are extrapolating any data, we have to remember that it has to be from a proper journal and data is likely to be changed as we move forward. So, we have to remain updated. So in this lecture, I have tried to gather whatever data is available and plus I have given certain opinions from our end, like what we are doing because convincing data is not available so far. So this is just the gist of how we are conducting cases in the operation theater. Any pediatric patient that comes up for a surgery, remember there are 6 steps involved. First step is the preparation of the OT. So preparation of the OT starts with identifying a case coach. He is the sort of a team leader. So he appoints the sisters. His job is that he appoints sisters which do not change in rotation. So they have to stay for the entire case. Then he appoints the anesthesiologist, the surgeon. He coordinates the arrangement of the PPE. He will be looking after the donning and doffing, and each step will be meticulously followed. So there is a need for a case coach. Now, personnel involved for each case, generally we require around 4 nurses. One is an induction nurse, second is a circulating nurse, which are donned with PPE and they remain in the OR. Then there are 2 nurses which are waiting outside. Also, we will be having 2 anesthesiologists. Remember, all cases we need 2 anesthesiologists. One may be just an anesthesia assistant. He may not be an assistant or a technician or a fellow. So the primary anesthesiologist is always the one whom we call as the contaminated anesthetist. And the other anesthetist will be the clean anesthetist who will be helping us with giving drugs or touching the anesthesia machine. So both the anesthesiologists would be staying in the OT properly donned, but their roles should not be mixed. So this is regarding the personnel. Now, pre-operatively, third step is the pre-operative evaluation. Remember, reviewing the patient, sedating the patient should be done only after proper donning, and this should be done by the primary anesthesiologist or the one who has properly donned himself. The other anesthetist will be involved in preparation of the OT because he is the cleaner anesthetist. The fourth step is the induction and the intubation, which I will be covering in the subsequent slide. Extubation is the fifth step, and the sixth step is the post-operative, like recovery and shifting to the PICU, etc., which will be covered in the subsequent slide. Now, remember, all pediatric patients are sedated in some form, so they involve some kind of general anesthesia. Like they have to be given general anesthesia. So, personal protective equipments of the highest grade, that is level 3, that is includes N95 mask, face shield and goggles, full body gowns, including head cover and shoe cover, should be used for all cases, because pediatric cases, all cases are considered as aerosol generating medical procedures. Now, so far, whatever cases we are doing, all cases we are doing RT-PCR tests. In an emergency, the reports may not be available, but still all the patients we are sending RT-PCR tests, and this has been mandated by the government. Preferably, positive cases should be done in negative pressure OT. It may not be available for in all the operation theaters, but at least laminar flows should be available, and proper PPE should be worn by in all cases. Now coming to the OT preparation. The OT preparation for anesthesiologists, remember, all unnecessary equipment should be kept outside the room. All drawers and shelves should be closed. Only the necessary drugs should be taken inside the operation theater in plastic sheets. All the supply carts, everything should be covered in plastic sheets. Any unnecessary equipments, all your mobile phones and wallets and etc. should be kept outside the operation theater, and the traffic inside the operation theater should be minimum. No personnel who is not required should be present inside the operation theater. This is the first step, and this should be done by the clean anesthesiologist. He may or may not don after the preparation. Usually they don after this initial preparation is done. Coming to the anesthesia machine preparation, as we already said, the anesthesia machine needs to be covered with a plastic sheet. A large tray on a Mayo stand must be kept ready so that all contaminated equipment are directly put inside the Mayo stand as soon as the induction is done. This is the kind of HEPA filter that we use. These are HME-F filters. HME filters are different from HME-F filters. And remember, pediatric, you have two kinds of filters. One for neonates and other one is for smaller children. So you have to take the filter for the appropriate age. And this should be between the patient and the LPs and the tube. And this should be kept ready. A disposable stethoscope or a clean stethoscope should be present in the operation theater, and inline suction is, if available, should be present for all cases. Now coming to the surgery team, the surgeon, it is important to remember that the surgeon doesn't stay inside the OT during induction and extubation, because these are aerosol generating procedures. So at this time, the surgeon may be initial period during induction, he may be taking the he will be doing the preparation. He should not be inside the operation theater when induction and extubation are done. Now coming to preoperative assessment, preoperative assessment should be done by the primary anesthesiologist. He is the contaminated anesthesiologist. So before he goes to see the patient, he will be properly donned. Now there is something called as a buddy system to ensure proper technique. The case coach that we have appointed, he will be monitoring how donning is done, and each step should be done in a proper way. Now the primary anesthesia provider, after donning, will go to the recovery area or wherever the patient is kept, and he will be seeing the patient, he will be checking consents, he will be giving pre-medications only after a proper donning is done, whereas the secondary anesthetist will be at the simultaneously preparing the operation theater. Now, this is what is recommended in the COVID era. Now, crying and coughing, as we discussed, is an aerosol generating procedure. So, all children coming inside the operation theater, they must receive sedative pre-medication, and they should not be crying and coughing when they come inside. Remember, parental presence is an absolute no-no, because our aim is to reduce personnel during the procedure. So, parental presence is not at all allowed. So good sedative pre-medication and adequate time for pre-medication should be allowed for all cases. Once the child is pre-medicated, he is given a surgical face mask with or without O2 depending on the patient. Now, no patient should be carried inside the operation theater. They have to be taken on a stretcher, and proper pathways should be followed depending on your operation theater. They should not be carried by any personnel. They should be transported on a stretcher or a wheelchair, whatever is available. Now, coming to sedative pre-medication, as I already said, most patients would come with IV lines. In this era, what we prefer is IV induction. So, if they have an IV line, the pre-medication that we generally give is midazolam or dexmedetomidine. Midazolam in a dose of say 0.05 to zero point 0.1 milligram per kg should suffice. Dexmedetomidine, if given, can be given in doses of 1 to 2 microgram per kg slowly. Now, sometimes it happens that the IV line may be out or he may not have an IV line. Then what we are doing nowadays is we are combining midazolam 0.5 milligram per kg orally along with 5 milligram per kg of ketamine and give a time of around 30 to 45 minutes. And after the child is properly pre-medicated, rather than doing an inhalational induction, we take the IV line under this kind of sedation, and only then we take the patient inside the operation theater. Now, we as children's anesthesia services have always been big fans of inhalational inductions. So, our sequence of induction would include a sedative pre-medication, then waiting for half an hour to 45 minutes, then an inhalational induction with sevoflurane, and then subsequent IV line. But this is something which you should not do because an inhalational induction is considered as more aerosol generating than intravenous induction. So nowadays, what is recommended is an intravenous induction, and a rapid sequence induction should be done in all the cases. So patient should, an IV line is a priority and it should be taken prior to induction. Now timeouts, pre-COVID, we were doing only one timeout, which was a pre-intubation timeout. Now what is required or what we are following is three timeouts. The first timeout is pre-intubation, the second timeout is post-intubation, and the third timeout is post-extubation. That is, after any aerosol generating procedure, you should do a timeout and check whether all the steps are being followed. Now, coming to the journals, this is a research or sort of a consensus guideline which has been published in Anesthesia Analgesia as recently as April 14th or 15th, I think. And this is a consensus guidelines from 35 pediatric hospitals from all across the world. So what they have recommended is what I will be covering in the subsequent slide. So what they have recommended is all inductions should be rapid sequence inductions, and endotracheal intubation should be done in all the patients. The intubation should be done by the senior most anesthesiologist. Now the goal is to minimize spray. So what we do is whatever face mask we have applied, we take the child inside with that face mask. That face mask is not removed until IV drugs are given. Once IV induction agents are given and scoline is given, or rocuronium in a dose of 0.6 to 1.2 milligram per kg, if it is a major case, once it is given, then we do intubation with cuffed endotracheal tubes along with a video laryngoscope or a direct laryngoscope. Now, as we have already said, HMEF filters are kept ready. So what we do is we keep the tubes clamped with some kind of a clamp with some artery forceps or something. And once induction is done and these HMEF filters are attached, only then we remove those clamps. So this helps in prevention of aerosols. Now, using an intubation box is a very good idea. Now, a number of designs and shapes are available in these intubation boxes. This is what Dr. Bala Venkat sir had sent, and we have made a similar design in one of the hospitals that I am working. So this should have 4 holes. 2 holes should be for intubation. 1 hole should be for the assistant who may be helping or maybe giving a cricoid pressure. And there should be another hole which is connected to a central suction so that it sort of creates a negative pressure. Ideally, this intubation box should be easily dismantled, and which makes it easier to clean. So this should be used in all possible cases. Now, what that study is recommended and what we are doing nowadays is more use of video laryngoscope, because you are not seeing directly inside the mouth when you are doing a laryngoscopy, and you are less likely to get exposed to aerosols when you are doing a video laryngoscope. Now, cuffed endotracheal tubes are preferred over uncuffed endotracheal tubes. what we are using nowadays are those micro cuff tubes by Heliard, previously Kimberly-Clark tubes. And only when the cuff is inflated, only then we remove those clamps and we start ventilation. So cuffed endotracheal tubes are preferred over uncuffed tubes, although it may not be available in all cases, and a tightly fitting uncuffed tube can also be used. Now you have to use minimum possible fresh gas flows in all possible cases. Now, if the anesthesia circuit needs to be disconnected, it has to be disconnected at this point, which means when you disconnect, the HMEF filter should always be attached to the tube when any kind of disconnection is done. Remember, whenever you have position changing during anesthesia, the tube should be properly secured. You use additional reinforcements whenever possible, because if you reinforce if the tube comes out, then that can be a disaster and it can cause the contamination of the entire operation theater. So the tube should be properly secured in all possible cases. Now these are the tubes that we are using. These are the micro cuff tubes or the Kimberly-Clark tubes, which are preferable. But as I said, even uncuffed tubes which are properly fitting can be used. Coming to LMAs, now this is a controversial topic. As far as data is concerned, so far most studies are saying that you have to avoid LMAs, and LMAs should be reserved only for cases of difficult intubation and should not be used for all cases. And if used, make sure that the fit is proper and the leakage should be minimal. And of course, you have to use second or third generation LMAs. Now coming to warmers. Now warmer is something, especially the forced air warmers like these warmers, if used prior to intubation or during intubation, these can cause aerosols to spread within the OT, and this can cause OT contamination. So what is recommended nowadays is the warmer should be used only when the patient are draped. So after the patient are draped, you can start using the warmers. There are no studies so far in which warmers are used with the bed sheets that they have provided. So as so far, so until the time the studies are available, what we are doing is we start warmers only after the intubation is done and the patient is properly draped, and the warmers are kept inside the drape so that the forced air does not cause any contamination of the OT. Now, post intubation, when does the surgeon come inside? Now, if you have a negative pressure OT, the surgeon can come inside immediately because there is less dispersion of the aerosols. But if you have something like a laminar airflow, what is recommended is you wait for 3 cycle changes, which takes around 10 to 15 minutes. So the surgeon who is waiting outside during induction would come inside only after 10 to 15 minutes post intubation. Now, these are 3 topics which needs to be discussed, and they are sort of slightly controversial. So coming to laparoscopy, now the guidelines that are followed are the SAGES guideline, which are universally followed all over the world. What they have recommended is, as far as possible, go for an open surgery over laparoscopy, because desufflation of abdomen can cause contamination of the OT because the gas spreads in the operation theater, and that can be considered as one form of aerosol. So as far as possible, go for an open procedure rather than a laparoscopic procedure. But if you have to do laparoscopy, if the surgeon is comfortable, then a gasless laparoscopy is a good idea over a laparoscopy with gas. If you are doing a laparoscopy with gas, then there are certain guidelines which have been prescribed, especially during desufflation. So during desufflation, if your insufflator has a desufflation mode, you should use that desufflation mode and not press the abdomen and cause contamination of the OT. If the desufflation mode is not available, then a sister or an assistant should be standing close by, and she should be sucking out all the gases that are coming out from the abdomen. So this is regarding laparoscopy. Now coming to energy devices or cauteries. Now an ideal cautery in this scenario is a cold cautery or cold knives, which may not be available in all cases because it doesn't cause tissue charring and it doesn't generate any smoke. Now smoke is considered as another aerosol. So what is, if you don't have cold knives or cold cauteries, then what you should be using is cauteries at minimum currents, and the surgeon should be modifying his technique in such a way that he causes minimal tissue charring, because tissue charring can lead to generation of the smoke. And also, while using a cautery, as we did in laparoscopy, one assistant should be standing with a suction machine, a central suction machine, and sucking out whatever gases that are generated. Now, the third controversy is regarding flexible endoscopy. Now, all bronchoscopies, gastroscopies, we have to remember that they generate a lot of aerosols, and they should be, as far as possible, they should be avoided. No diagnostic bronchoscopy should be performed unless it is very much needed. So you should try for diagnostic bronchoscopy, you should try for to substitute for other modalities like ultrasound or CT scan or whatever other modalities are available. But if it is done in an absolute emergency, then preferably it should be done in negative pressure operation theaters. Or if you don't have negative pressure operation theaters, then it should be done with proper care and with proper donning, and all possible precautions should be taken because these are very high aerosol generating procedures. Now we really don't know. We have a lot of confusion whether minor cases like say CLW or IND, should we intubate all cases? Should we put in an LMA? Should we do cases on mass? Because as far as logic goes, whenever we are doing cases on mass, on spontaneous respiration or LMA with spontaneous respiration, they should generate more aerosols than relaxation and intubation. So far we have been doing all cases with intubation, with proper relaxation, deep intubations, with rapid sequence inductions. So we really don't know whether modifications like covering the entire baby in a plastic sheet or using closed circuit with HME filter, whether it will be useful or not, we really don't know. Coming to JR circuits, also JR circuits, very little data is available. Some of the WFSA literature has like some in some low resource settings, what WFSA has described is if you don't have closed circuits, you can use JR circuits with HMEF filters attached to it. That is before the angle piece. But we really have no data about this. And so until the time we have data, what is preferable is intubating all cases and use of closed circuits with HMEF filters. Now coming to neonates and PPE, this is my photo in a PPE when I was doing a 4-day-old neonate. I have done a lot of neonates in the past 1 month, and believe me, it is one of the most difficult tasks to do. Besides wearing the PPE, which is difficult in all the cases, prolonged surgery, higher temperatures, lot of sweating, fogging of glasses makes doing neonates almost impossible. And I would say that you get used to the PPEs before you start doing neonates, because it's a totally different game doing neonates. Wearing a PPE and wearing that temperature of 25 to 26 degrees Celsius is very, very difficult. Just to give one personal experience, like I had done one day for a child ball rotation with volvulus, which was an emergency. We had sent a swab pre-op, but since it was a volvulus and a genuine emergency, we went ahead with the surgery. I was wearing a proper PPE. I had put a central line in that baby, and as it turns out, I was able to extubate the baby. But 2 days after that, his report came, and he turned out to be positive for COVID. So even a neonate can turn out to be positive for COVID, and you should not become complacent in any child whether they have symptoms or not. And PPE, level 3 PPE or level 2 PPE is a must for all cases, even if it is a neonate or an infant. Now coming to extubation, now intubation, as we said, we require two-person anesthesia providers. In extubation, you may not require two-person, so the second anesthetist is optional. You can do the extubation with just one scrub nurse. The surgeon should be waiting outside the operation theater during extubation, and extubation should ideally be done with a no-touch technique. Consider minimizing coughing with medications. Now certain medications, logically, if you see, there is no data available, but something like IV lignocaine or injecting lignocaine within the cuff of the tube may or may not help. There is no data, but it should help is what I believe. After extubation, remember that you throw the endotracheal tube directly in the yellow garbage bag. It should not touch anything because it is potentially a COVID carrying material. And as soon as extubation is done, you apply a simple oxygen mask with low flow rates immediately to the baby. Now, extubation, whether awake or deep, this has always been a controversial topic in pediatric anesthesia. Deep extubation logically should be more useful because there would be minimal coughing. But what I prefer is doing an awake extubation simply because I don't want a laryngospasm. Now this is my what the algorithm I follow during for laryngospasm. This is my personal algorithm, which involves a lot of use of CPAP and Larson's maneuver, and reaching for propofol and scoline is always the last resort. It is never the first resort for us. But nowadays, my threshold for using scoline has really go down because I don't want to use these maneuvers like CPAP and Larson's maneuver. I would rather give him scoline and intubate the child. My threshold is much lower for scoline and propofol. There is no data available so far, but this is what I believe, and this is what it should be followed. Now coming to recovery, in simple cases where the child has recovered well, what is recommended or what we are doing is the primary anesthesia provider or the nurse can monitor the baby within the operation theater itself for till the time the baby recovers. If he needs to be shifted to the PICU and if he is extubated, then he can be shifted with a face mask. If he is intubated, then what you should follow is either you use an ambu bag, but don't disconnect the HME filter. You use the same HME filter between your endotracheal tube and your ambu bag, and then shift the child to the PICU on the ventilator. Now, doffing is as important as donning. What they have recommended is a minimum time of 4 to 5 minutes or even more for doffing. And as we had done for donning, a buddy system or someone monitoring your doffing for each step should be done for all cases. Now, having covered the intraoperative part, now remember this is the guidelines for BLS and PALS. Something has changed. Now we are in the middle of a pandemic. Remember, in a pandemic, we are already heroes, and this is no time for heroics. So before you start chest compressions, even if the patient is dying, first thing you should do is don PPE. This is the major change that they have done in BLS. So no chest compressions or anything should be started without donning a proper PPE, and the personnel should be limited. Another change which has been done is the back mask should be a properly fitted one, and it should be used with a tight seal and with an HMEF filter. Now similar changes have been done with in the PALS score. Same way, even in the PALS score, even if the patient has arrested, the first thing that you will do is don PPE. No cardiac compression should be started or no touching the patient without PPE. PPE is a must, and it is the first step of PALS and BLS for pediatric and adults. Now, similar to what has been recommended in BLS, you always ventilate with a tight fitting mask with an HME filter. So if you are using ambu bag, then you use the ambu bag with a reservoir and a tight fitting mask. And the threshold for intubation should be lower. So you should straight away go for intubation. Now, this is the last part of the lecture. These are the resources. CDC and WHO websites are very good websites, and they keep updating the data regarding COVID, and we should be following those data. For pediatric anesthesia journal keeps on updating. There are societies like Society of Pediatric Anesthesia of USA, APA of Great Britain and Ireland, European Society of Pediatric Anesthesia, Australian Society, even our IAPA. So they have recommended the guidelines that we have covered so far. And remember that these guidelines are not the Bible of pediatric anesthesia. They are likely to be changed, and we have to remain updated. And whatever I have said may change very, very quickly as soon as data becomes available. Now, these are some of the social media coverage on Twitter and Facebook groups are available for COVID-19, and they are very useful, and you can join them. Now, these are very, very stressful times. We are going through a lot of stress and anxiety, and CDC has recommended a lot of steps for healthcare workers, like how to cope up with the stress, and you can go through these sites. They are very, very useful. I have gone through them, and I am personally following them to keep myself stress free. So now I hand over back to Rushali madam, and Rushali madam will be continuing with the second session. Thank you.